welcome everybody. It's great to see everybody here tonight. I'm Laura and I'm from the English Collective of Prostitutes, and I'm chairing the event tonight and we're introducing our report. The event tonight is hosted by Nadia Whittam MP, who can't be here with us unfortunately, but supports our campaign, and we're very appreciative of all the work that she's doing to support decriminalisation and be...
Can you speak up?
Yes, I can speak up. Is that better? Support decriminalisation on behalf of sex workers in Parliament, so we're very appreciative of her work. So tonight we welcome you to launch two reports. The first is a report done by us, the ECP, Proceed Without Caution, the impact of prostitute cautions and convictions on sex workers' lives, and a report exposed from all sides by the European Sex Workers' Rights Alliance in collaboration with the ECP. So we're also here today so that MPs can hear directly from sex workers, and also to galvanise support against government proposals to increase the criminalisation of sex work, which you will hear about shortly. I just wanted to say very quickly, there are people from ECP Network videoing and filming, so please can nobody else take photos and do filming, because some people do not want to be filmed for anonymity reasons, and they will also be filming parts of the audience. So if there's anybody that doesn't want to be filmed or photographed, please can you move to a corner of the room. I'm sorry to say that, but that corner over there, so it's clear that you don't want to be recorded, basically. So just to give you an idea, we have a wonderful panel tonight who you will hear from, and then we will call from a few speakers from the floor, and then we will open up to question and answer. So we shall begin. Okay, just to say briefly, the ECP is a network of sex workers working both on the streets and indoors, campaigning for decriminalisation of prostitution, sex workers' rights and safety, and for resources to enable people to get out of prostitution if they want to. We fight against being treated like criminals, and we've helped sex workers win against charges of soliciting, brothel keeping and controlling, the last two most often used against sex workers working together for safety. We highlight that most sex workers are mothers trying to do the best for their children, and we campaign against austerity cuts and for housing and other survival resources so that none of us are institutionalised in prostitution because of poverty. So I'm going to tell you first a bit about our report, which is here. You can get a copy at the back there on the leaflet table. To launch our report, thousands of women in the UK have received a prostitute caution and or been convicted for prostitution offences. That is for loitering or soliciting for working on the street, and for brothel keeping or controlling prostitution for working together from premises with others. Prostitute cautions are a barrier to getting another job and leaving sex work, and can mean that sex workers lose custody of children, are put at risk of violence, denied compensation, deported or prevented from travelling. Having a prostitute caution and a criminal record for prostitution offence brands sex workers as criminals, making us an easy target for the police and others in authority to discriminate and deny our rights. It can put sex workers at greater risk of exploitation, rape and other violence, and is a barrier to getting another job and leaving sex work. Prostitute cautions are given to women the police believe are loitering and soliciting. They do not require women to admit guilt. There is no right of appeal and remain on your record until you are 100 years old. Imagine that. It differs from a police caution, therefore. A police caution is issued on the basis that a person accepts guilt for the offence they're being cautioned about. A prostitute caution can be issued to anyone the police claim to have reasonable cause to believe has committed an offence of loitering and soliciting. There doesn't actually need to be evidence of loitering and soliciting, just for the police to say that they believe this is happening. The police of discretion of this kind is an invitation to abuse of power. There is no right of appeal against a prostitute caution, as I said. A police caution is spent after 2.5 years and filtered out from someone's record after 6 and doesn't need to be disclosed to employers. And as I said, a prostitute caution will show on an enhanced check until you're 100. So what we found in the report, we interviewed 12 women about the impact of prostitute cautions and convictions on their lives. And this was community-based research conducted by sex workers, many of whom had convictions themselves, who interviewed their workmates and friends. Cautions and convictions impacted women in a number of ways. So, number 1, leaving prostitution or finding other work. A quote, "I had to refuse work which I'm totally qualified for because I have been criminalised. I'll never know what life could have been." Over 2/3 of the women interviewed said that a prostitute's caution and/or conviction had been the reason they found it hard to leave sex work and find another job. The second was access to justice. A quote, "My record stopped me getting compensation after a very brutal attack that almost killed me." And 2/3 of women interviewed stated that they would be less likely to report any crimes committed against them. The third was relationships. Cautions like mine don't just affect the adults who receive the caution, they affect their children. It made me a lot more compliant about allowing my son to be in contact with my ex-partner, who was a dangerous man. And 2/3 of the women interviewed described that having cautions or convictions on their record had caused problems in their relationships with friends or family. Another was housing. So one woman said, "I wouldn't even bother applying. A conviction limits us. It's just so wrong." And what we found, local authorities often have a policy of not housing people with criminal convictions, and or women can forcibly be evicted if they get a conviction after they have been housed. The last was immigration, and one woman said, "I even have British citizenship but still do feel the threat of deportation." Having cautions makes you undesirable to admit under Home Office guidelines, and they can also be grounds for deportation. Insecure immigration status also makes women more vulnerable to resist police harassment. So I just wanted to say a bit more about the police, who are responsible for implementing the prostitution laws. And for those who don't know, that sex workers speak of daily humiliation, bullying, threats, violence at the hands of police officers, and have been shown to be one group of vulnerable women targeted by police rapists and abusers. One study in East London actually found that 42% of street sex workers had experienced violence from the police themselves. We're part of the growing sex worker-led movement for decriminalisation, and the other movement that we know and are sometimes a part of. So the anti-deportation, the anti-racist movements, Black Lives Matter, disability rights and climate change movements, and other movements for justice have succeeded in getting official confirmation of our experiences at the hands of the police. And report after report have shown and exposed them as misogynistic, racist, homophobic and criminally corrupt. And as a result, sex workers who complain of police violence and abuse are now more likely to be believed. By others in the movement anyway, and the wider public. By publishing this report, which spells out the wide-ranging, lifelong harm and injustice prostitute cautions and convictions inflict on women, we hope to galvanise greater support for the decriminalisation of sex work and against women's poverty. We also want to provide clarity in relation to those organisations and individuals who are pressing for women's cautions and convictions to be expunged, yet refuse to support current sex workers in our struggle for decriminalisation. This government has announced its intention to increase the criminalisation of sex work, including by redefining prostitution as sexual exploitation. If all sex work is labelled as sexual exploitation, anyone who associates with sex workers, work colleagues, drivers, security, will be classed as exploiters and liable for prosecution. Police raids and arrests of sex workers are likely to increase. Sex workers' clients would be criminalised on the grounds of participating in sexual exploitation, which is effectively the same as introducing the Nordic model, with the associated harms detail which we will lay out on this panel. The websites that sex workers use to advertise themselves would also be criminalised for facilitating exploitation. Online advertising makes sex workers much safer and gives them greater autonomy because it allows them to screen clients, protect their privacy and work independently. Without the ability to advertise online, far more sex workers would be forced to work on the street, with a much greater likelihood of experiencing violence. They would also be forced to rely on potentially exploitative third parties in order to find work. We are not only victims, we are survivors and campaigners, part of the women's movement against rape, domestic violence, poverty and exploitation. I'm nearly finished, don't I? I just wanted to make a point about the criminalisation of survival. Of course, sex workers are not the only ones who are criminalised for trying to survive. The numbers of women being convicted for shoplifting and other small value theft are increasing as poverty rises. Most women in prison are there for crimes of poverty. And those of us who are women of colour face disproportionately higher levels of arrests and imprisonment. Prison sentences have been abolished for loitering and soliciting, but women are still going to prison for non-payment of fines and for brothel keeping, controlling prostitution. Campaigns are growing in visibility and determination to end prison, particularly for pregnant women and mothers, including because of the impact on children. The Labour government moves in this direction of trying to crack down on prostitution with no reference to the poverty that women face and why we are in prostitution in the first place. They refuse to lift the 2-child limit, which would immediately reduce prostitution. 1.6 million children in the UK are affected by the 2-child limit, and according to Child Poverty Action Group, 10,000 children have been pulled into poverty by the 2-child limit since this government took office, not very long ago. Scrapping the 2-child limit is the most cost-effective way to reduce child poverty and immediately decrease the number of sex workers. There is money for war but not to relieve poverty. £576 million in arms exports have been sent to Israel for their genocide in Gaza. We want that money to relieve poverty. Just have one more example, which is that money can be practically rediverted from persecution and prosecution into women's hands for protection and support to keep children with their mothers. Another big example is a guaranteed care income pilot in the US, initiated by the US Prostitutes Collective, our sister organisation. The pilot provides monthly payments of $2,000 a month to 10 women who are single mothers at risk of criminalisation and losing their children to social services. Not all are sex workers, so that women are not labelled as sex workers just being part of the programme. And the payments are not a charity, but a recognition of their caring work, raising children and sustaining others. It only started a few months ago, so we're still finding out a lot more about it, and it's obviously a very small pilot, but the benefits are already emerging. Mothers were homeless, not able to eat properly, run ragged, had ill health and worried about their children. Most had been incarcerated and or had children taken from them by the state. They report that as a result of the money, their physical and mental health has improved. They have more time with their children, less stressed, and are less worried, and the children benefit from that. Something like that could be easily done here. Finally, there's a massive body of research that shows the benefit of putting money in women's hands. In the US in 2021, they expanded the child tax credit, which gave $3,000 a year to families for every child, which reduced poverty by 46%. And most importantly, enabled women to escape unwanted partners, that is domestic violence. So we want the government to invest in caring, not killing, and we want a care income now for the work that we are doing. So just to finish our 3 demands for the government, we want decriminalisation of sex work, we want records expunged so that we're not institutionalised in prostitution, and we want targeted resources at sex workers to enable us to leave if and when we want to. Thank you very much.
It was very aggressive, like what you see in the movies. They broke down the doors and came in, shouting to stay on the ground, bringing into the rooms and pulling us out. It is a frightening experience because you are scared they will shoot you on the spot or something, because it is chaos and you cannot think properly amidst all the noise. And you cannot see anything but with the lights they are putting in your head, in your eyes. So even though they are shouting police, you don't think it's the police, because it's like you're getting raided by a gang or something. So it's very scary. I was in a room with a client, and they were pulling us out of the rooms. They grabbed us with only our underwear and searched everything. There were a lot of men, and they were very frightening, asking all kinds of questions. And some of the girls didn't speak much English. It was like what you think they would do if they knew for sure there is some armed gangster or someone like that inside. It calmed down when they saw there was nothing to find, no drugs, no children, or no woman doctor. So these are words from Mali, a sex worker who faced rape while working in London as a sex worker. This interview and hundreds more constitute the most expansive community-led research on policing developed and conducted by sex workers themselves in Europe and the UK. Its findings are shocking and reveal the climate of fear in which sex workers live, and this report makes clear recommendations to listen to sex workers, to decriminalize sex work, and to reform policing. Hello everyone, my name is Lucas Stevenson. I'm a former sex worker and the previous coordinator of the European Sex Worker Rights Alliance, which is a network of 100 organizations across Europe that advocate for the rights of sex workers. and is the organization that produced the report. The report will actually be launched at the European Parliament in a few weeks, but you can already find a policy brief, which is around 10 pages, available with the QR code here. So if you don't have it around, come and grab it. So I'm here in two capacities. First, to present some of the findings of the research, but also as the first global lead on community engagement of the International Planned Parenthood Federation, which is a global sexual and reproductive health and rights federation, which provides services to millions of individuals across the world. So about the research. The research are based on semi-structured, in-depth interviews with sex workers conducted by peer researchers across 11 European countries, including the UK. And in total, 199 interviews of sex workers are included in this research. Sorry about that. The sex workers were selected through a purposive sampling strategy to reflect the diversity in working conditions, street work, indoor worker, online worker, migration status, sexuality, and gender. The organization partner in the UK was the English collective of Prostitutes. Among the participants, around 63% identified as cis women, 23% as trans women, and 33% were migrants. The research is the first of its kind on this issue. It's a fully participatory research grounded in feminist action research methodology. And so first of all, I want to take a minute to acknowledge the incredible work done by ESWA, the English collective of Prostitutes, all the peer researchers that were involved, and in particular, the lead researcher who's in the room tonight, Chloe Dominic, if you want to say a little wave. So I think she deserves a huge round of applause for 2 years of work on this research. And once the research is out, I invite you to read it, and really it's quite a hard read because of the amount of violence that you will read in the research. So here are some of the key findings you will find in the research. The main findings is, we already know this, that sex workers fear the police. The sex workers don't trust the police. They fear the police and they have really good reason to do so. Among the interviewers, 28% reported physical violence from the police. A third of the interviewers, a third of the sex workers reported physical violence from the police. Another 26% reported sexual violence from the police, whether they were comments from sexual nature to actual rape. Threats, coercion, blackmail. 42% were subjected to this form of abuse. And the vast majority, almost 70%, experienced harassment and emotional abuse from police officers. A clear concern as well is that when sex workers do decide to report violence or crime, which is not very often, the majority did not get support from the police. Here is what Jessica said in her interview. There was one time when I was violently attacked. The man really injured me badly, and I went to the police. I usually wouldn't go to the police, but I was so badly injured with massive bruises on my body. I said I wanted to see him prosecuted, and some higher-up policeman interviewed me, even when I was still injured and hurting. He said to me that I had to tell him everything I know about what's going on in the area, because I was living in this area. And they wanted information about other people. And I said, no, I don't know anything about anything, which was the truth. And I showed him my injuries. But he said, I don't care about that. When you decide to tell us what you know, then we'll do something about it. And this experience is not isolated. First of all, out of the interviewees sample, only 40% considered calling the police for help. So actually a minority of the interviewees decided to report the crime to the police. And 54% of those who reported instances were actually failed by the police, who refused to intervene when they sought assistance, like in the case of Jessica. Sex workers know this already, that the police inaction leads to increased violence against sex workers and all women and society in general, as the perpetrators of violence are able to continue attacking, robbing, and raping sex workers and other members of the communities. It is also very important to note in this research that many police officers were pretending to be clients in order to access sex workers. And this is something we know in the community. How many of us have been in the situation where we go with a client to realize that actually he is a police officer? And furthermore, discrimination after reporting was also an important finding, with around 70% who said they were discriminated when reporting crimes against themselves. So the conclusions and recommendations are not going to surprise anyone. These findings are not new. We know that sex workers, migrants, racial communities have always denounced for years, decades, police violence, racism, sexism, and transphobia, like Laura said earlier. But this research adds to the number of research by the community, by academics, on the need to change the way sex work is treated and the way we are considering sex workers. We need to urgently transform the whole criminal justice system. Sorry, I misread my notes. The research highlights the urgent need for transformative justice approach, as conventional policing often exacerbates harm. Some of the key recommendations include strengthening sex worker organization. In some countries where sex work is decriminalized, like New Zealand, some states in Australia, sex worker organizations are actually funded by the government. This will have a huge impact on sex worker safety if tomorrow the English collective of prostitutes and other sex worker organizations were actually funded by the state to provide the support they are already giving, often on a shoestring budget. Investment in community-based safeguarding as well, to build community-led safety networks as alternative to law enforcement. And we know that some organizations like National Agreements in the UK already play some of this role, but it's important to really strengthen the role of this community organization. And of course, decriminalization of sex work, which has been recognized by Amnesty International, International Planned Parenthood Federation, many UN bodies, and a lot of research that is the best model to ensure sex workers have access to safety. So the research will be launched at the European Parliament in a few weeks. It will be available online, and there will be several launches in the 11 countries that participate in the research. And then just a few words, because I was a sex worker activist, and I still am, I assume, for the last 20 years, but I now work for the International Planned Parenthood Federation. If you don't know, it's the largest sexual reproductive health and rights federation in the world, providing around 70 million services across the world, in many countries, in particular in the global south. And around 80% of these services are to poor and marginalized people, including sex workers. And a couple of years ago, because of the demand of sex workers community, the International Planned Parenthood Federation made a clear position on sex workers' rights and the decriminalization of sex work. And the logic behind it is that sex workers are asking for the same respect and dignity as other community members. IPPF is a champion for SRHR, sexual and reproductive health and rights, and really believes in bodily autonomy. And we see this word used a lot in different circles, including by some progressive members of parliament who believe in bodily autonomy as long as it's not about sex work. So, and actually a few weeks ago, IPPF was hosting a reception at the UK House of Parliament with different members of parliament in support for reproductive health and rights and access to abortion. And sadly, some of these members of parliament, who on one hand support access to abortion, are on the other hand calling for criminalization of clients and rejecting and refusing to recognize that sex workers have the capacities to make decisions about their own bodies. And just to finish, we all know this, but we are facing a global backlash against women's rights, human rights, migrants' rights, and many other marginalized communities, including LGBT communities. We talk about backlash, but this war doesn't cover the reality of what is happening. A global, extremely well-funded and coordinated movement led by religious extremists, populist leaders, and private companies are coordinating and working together to attack and destroy some of our fundamental rights. We all know what happened, when was it already? A few days ago, a week ago, with the election of Trump. In the new administration of Trump will have a huge impact globally on women's rights, in the US of course, but globally because the US is one of the main funders for access to abortion globally. And I think we do need to call out members of parliament, organizations, women's rights organizations, who on one hand talk about women's rights and bodily autonomy, and on the other hand call for the criminalization of client and criminalization of sex work. We know that there is no liberation without liberation for all, and sex workers have made this demand for decades. For more than 50 years, sex workers have said that we don't want to see our mothers in prisons. We want resources, so we don't have to do sex work if we don't want to do sex work. And the UK could be in an amazing position to be a champion for reproductive rights, but also for sex workers' rights. We know that several political parties, like the Greens and the Liberal Democrats, are already supporting sex work. It's really time for other political parties, in particular the Labour Party, to align itself with organizations like Amnesty International and sex workers' rights, to make a clear commitment to sex workers' rights. So I just wanted to say thank you again to ECP, to Chloe, and in particular to all the sex workers who are participating in the research that we did. It was a huge effort. It's the biggest research done by sex workers on the topic of policing, and we're really glad to see it published next week. So thank you very much, and come and talk to me with information.
Hi everyone, it's hard to follow the speakers, so I'm going to be brief. First of all, I wanted to say that we're very privileged to be in this room tonight and to hear from sex workers. This unfortunately is very rare. There is policy making and laws made in this very house building without the participation of sex workers. This is completely unacceptable and it's time to change. So there are a lot of new MPs, maybe not in this room, but in Parliament, and I think they have an opportunity to educate themselves on sex work and decriminalization. As has been said before, Amnesty International has long recognized that the best option to protect the human rights of sex workers is decriminalization. We understand the root cause of sex work to be poverty, as we have heard tonight. And so decriminalization is the first step, is what is needed to get started for sex workers to enjoy their economic and social rights and the right to privacy and family life. And again, to new MP, I want to say that there is still a lot of misunderstanding on what decriminalization is, which is different from legalization. Decriminalization means taking out sex work and activities around sex work, like organization of sex work or working in premises, taking those out of the criminal justice code. It doesn't necessarily mean that there needs to be further legalization or policy making around sex work. It's just make sure that these are not crimes anymore and that people are not criminalized. So there's still a lot of misunderstanding. And the other thing that is so misunderstood on purpose sometimes is that decriminalization would encourage sex work and would also decriminalize trafficking and exploitation. This is absolutely not true, because trafficking, exploitation and violence would remain crimes. Decriminalization means women can leave sex work if they want to. They don't have the criminal records that affect them all lifelong, as we've heard. And it would also help real victims of trafficking and exploitation, because by removing the threat of criminalization, people would feel a bit more confident reaching out to the police. And the other thing that we hear is that the human rights claims around what human rights say about trafficking and exploitation. And this is something that I think we will hear more and more as there will be moves to change policies and also legislation around sex work. Basically, in human rights law, it is clear, crystal clear, that there is a distinction between prostitution and exploitation of prostitution. And prostitution per se is not synonymous with exploitation. So again, we've heard so much evidence. There's evidence that Amnesty International has produced over the years. There's that evidence from UN bodies, from sex workers themselves, and it's really time that this evidence is considered, that policy making and laws are based on evidence, and sex workers are listened to and can come into this room and have a conversation about their lives. Thank you.
Okay, so for those of you who don't know, Women Against Rape is a multiracial grassroots organisation, one of the longest standing anti-rape groups in the country. We're based at Crossroads Women's Centre, and we campaign for safety, protection, compensation for all women and girls who have suffered rape, domestic violence and racist attacks. I'm here because sadly Layla Omar, who was going to speak from Women Against Rape, couldn't be here because of illness. But she was going to speak about a really important struggle, and that was the struggle that defeated a public space protection order in Newham. And if that had gone through, it would have increased the criminalisation of sex workers in the area. And it would have done, as we've heard so many times already tonight, nothing to address the situations of women, or the reasons why women are out on the streets in the first place, as we've heard, poverty and homelessness, to name but a few. Labour was centrally involved in opposing the attempts by a local councillor who falsely claimed that Muslim women were upset by sex workers on the streets and were pushing for this police crackdown in their area. And she said, "You don't represent us and don't use us to support this. Any complaints that we have as Muslim women are of harassment, and that's down to the Islamophobia over the years." So she really nailed it, for what it was. And this was a really important issue to fight on at a local authority level, and we won. And that's always good to hear. And the authority was forced to change its strategy from a punitive approach to one which was based on women's health and safety. And if you want to know more about that campaign, ECP, who were centrally involved, can tell you more as well. Obviously, we've come with a message of support for this meeting for decriminalisation. And from the start, we've always supported sex workers' rights and opposed criminalisation because we know that it increases violence, that increased violence against sex workers, and if they're not safe, then none of us is safe. And we've always worked closely with the ECP, and together we helped 2 sex workers take a private prosecution against a man who raped them when the CPS refused to even prosecute. The prosecutors were so bigoted that they said that the woman would make unreliable witnesses. And that is just an outrage, and that just tells you, what they think of women. Well, we won that too, and the man was sent to prison for 11 years. So, over the years, we've helped many sex workers get justice after they've been raped and suffered other attacks, including, as I said, racist attacks. And frankly, following on from what Becky said about the moral feminists, we're appalled that so much of the violence against women's sector nationally has not been inclusive or supportive of sex workers' demands to decriminalise their work. Why aren't these women addressing the poverty, the homelessness, and the widespread destitution and discrimination that makes all of us more vulnerable to violence? What is their problem? It's basic. It's a really basic issue. It seems to us that criminalisation gives police massive powers against us. If we're criminalised, we're therefore a vulnerable sector of people, whoever we are. And there's a lot of evidence, as we've heard, to show that the rapists' police, the officers, target sex workers, along with other vulnerable groups like women with disabilities, like women of colour, immigrant and migrant women. And it's really very clear at this time, when more is coming out about serving police officers who rape, their rampant sexism, the rampant racism, the violence, the corruption which you've heard about, and the illegality and their impunity. And examples include, the killing of men of colour like Jean-Charles de Menezes and more recently Chris Cabba, to the killing of Sarah Everard by Wayne Couzens, and to the arrest of his serial rapist colleague from the same Parliamentary and Diplomatic Protection Force. Who knows how many more are hiding in there, right? And the force, they're protecting them or pensioning them off. And some have even been promoted. So this is the time that we're in, and it's coming out. So we should all be supporting decriminalisation because it takes the power away from the police. And we should be demanding that the police do their job and prioritise going after violent men. It is their job. Thank you.
Representing some work I've been doing with a colleague, Laura Connolly, who's at the University of Sheffield, who can't be here tonight, unfortunately. but we were asked by the ECP to have a look at prostitutes' cautions in a bit more kind of detail in terms of the official data, in terms of the official kind of recorded data, and we distributed extensive freedom of information requests to all of the police forces in the UK and in the various organisations in charge of overseeing the DBS system and kind of criminal records checks and services. And part of our work was to try and get kind of an accurate sense of the prevalence and the distribution of prostitutes' cautions, and we essentially failed at doing that. It was really, really hard to identify how many people receive cautions, kind of full stop, and I'll talk a bit about that. But I think one of the things that's important is in trying to do that, it reveals particularly kind of how sinister and horrible prostitutes' cautions are, as well as the kind of broader prostitution policy kind of legislation landscape in general. They really capture kind of the ambiguity and the kind of mystification of control that's really grounded that those people are kind of grappling with and having to hide or kind of try to escape. So one of the key things that we found routinely is that when we were asking the police forces for information on prostitutes' cautions, is that they said that the cautions are really informal and they're ultimately they didn't see them as kind of noteworthy being reported. They're seen as non-reportable offences, which kind of, given the kind of massively kind of violent impact they have on people's lives, is really kind of profound in and of itself. For instance, just got some examples that we can show. So West Mercia Police said that no information is held. This type of matter is classified as non-recorded by the Home Office, so there's no requirement for the force to record it. Manchester Police said something similar. The prostitutes' caution isn't recorded as a crime on our system, so we're unable to provide you any data. So trying to get a sense of this stuff is really, really difficult. And on top of that, we were kind of met with these often very kind of patronising discussions from police forces that just said, well, we don't give out prostitutes' cautions. South Wales Police, for instance, said we haven't given out prostitutes' caution ever, but we know through our work in Safety First Wales that women have been given prostitute cautions as recently as 2017. So there's a massive disjuncture between the kind of the official truth and the truth. Sex worker forces are being intentionally misrepresented, or kind of they're just told, I don't know what the right word is.
Lying.
They're lying, yeah, lying and gaslighting and just saying we're not, and they are, and they're found to be doing that. And we have somebody in our network who kind of got the ticket out and said, here it is, you can see it. So, so that's kind of something to kind of talk about. So they're really arbitrary. Lots of forces didn't give us any data, but we did get some data from some police forces. For instance, Derbyshire Constabulary said that they've given 33 cautions since 2017, including 9 last year, and that's something that I think is really important. There are kind of obviously the historic examples, and there's an increasing tendency, particularly amongst kind of academic circles, to say that these are kind of a relic of the past, but this data that we've got shows that they're still very much being used, and they're part of kind of contemporary policing, intimidation tactics of control and manipulation. West Yorkshire Police have given 79 cautions since 2009. And again, others in 2017. Essex Police said as a notion of goodwill, given the amount of work it takes in identifying these things, they looked at 2015 and found that there were 9 given out in 2015 in Essex. So prostitutes' cautions are really vague, they're hard to pin down, they have massively disastrous effects for people that receive them. But there's also something that we wanted to look at more broadly in terms of kind of prostitutes' cautions that are on people's disclosures as well. So not just looking at the prostitutes' caution, but cautions for all kind of prostitution-related offences. And that's something really important to think about when we think about broader demands for the decriminalisation of sex work and the expunging of all criminal records for prostitution-related offences, is that a significant number of women still have prostitute-related offences disclosed on their criminal records and in their DBS checks. So DBS data shows that 268 individuals have had a total of 354 disclosures of prostitute cautions made in the past decade. And then there is a drop-off around the time of 2017 in terms of how stuff's reported, but I think we might talk about that in a bit more detail. So we've kind of, the argument that Laura and I are trying to make in the work that we're doing is this kind of drop-off should be treated with real caution, and we should be really careful to interpret that, because there's this idea that somehow the police are becoming more benevolent and more compassionate. And if we listen to kind of sex workers' voices, if you look at this stuff, this kind of narratives around safeguarding and vulnerability is just a way of dressing up repressive policing practices. We know that kind of immigration rates are becoming welfare checks, and they're just kind of changing the language, but the realities of them and their impacts are massive, are still the same. So when we looked at the broader kind of impacts, there are 807 enhanced and 82 standard disclosures have been dispatched to women since 2013 for brothel keeping. 178 enhanced and 40 standard disclosures were dispatched to women since 2013 for controlling prostitution for gain. In the last year, 63 women had a prostitution offence disclosed in England and Wales. So this is something that's really happening. I mean, if you think about each of these disclosures is when somebody's been offered a job or is trying to get some sort of opportunity to do something to provide for their families or to support themselves. It kind of provides some context. We were talking about, or I think I alluded to, this idea that there are these very well-rehearsed statements that we get given by the police when we're asking for this work. Homicide said that they don't give any cautions, and they said sex workers are treated as vulnerable victims and they're not punished for sex working. But our wider research and the kind of sex workers' experiences that we've heard this evening make it very clear that policing doesn't make sex workers safe. So prostitutes' cautions and disclosures of prostitution offences have a devastating impact on women's lives, and we're really questioning the framing of the police that they're part of a broader rehabilitative term that should be really resisted and dismantled. They're a particular kind of way of embedding control in a really kind of sinister way, we think. And one of the really key things that prostitution cautions aren't temporarily restricted. If you can receive one in the 80s, it still has the haunting effect, it still has massive impacts on people's lives. They're inescapable. And that's one of the really profound things we've been trying to highlight. So, just to finish, I guess that's exactly why prostitutes' caution should be resisted, and the work that we're just hearing, any effort to challenge them is really important, but that must be part of a broader effort to decriminalise sex work entirely and to expunge all criminal records so that none of them are on anybody's records ever. That should be part of a broader effort to target resources to sex workers to enable and empower them to leave sex work if and when they choose. So thank you.
Hello, good evening everyone. Thanks so much to ECP for their excellent report. I'm a lawyer and I occasionally represent women in ECP's network, and I wanted to talk briefly about the ways that prostitute cautions affect my clients, and as Laura said, a little bit about what we do and can do. As the report explains, prostitute cautions are different to ordinary cautions. Laura touched on this too. An ordinary caution can only be administered to someone who admits the offence and gives informed consent to receive a caution as an alternative to having an opportunity to defend themselves in court. The police can issue a prostitute caution to a woman without her consent and without any admission of guilt. The behaviour giving rise to the caution doesn't need to be a criminal offence, and the police don't need to provide evidence other than a statement from two officers confirming that they have reasonable cause to believe that the woman was loitering or soliciting. There are very few safeguards in place as to the quality of the evidence that the police must provide. In practice, as the report explains, this can be very sketchy, and I've certainly seen cases where it's extremely thin. Section 1 of the Street Offences Act makes it an offence for a person to persistently loiter or solicit in the street for the purposes of offering services as a prostitute. Conduct is persistent if it takes place more than twice in 3 months. So a woman who's received a prostitute caution twice in 3 months is likely to be charged for loitering and soliciting. The fact that she's received 2 cautions is pretty much all that's required for the magistrates to convict her. As a matter of law, if anyone wishes to apply for a job or participate in voluntary activities, including children or vulnerable adults, they have to obtain an enhanced DBS check. Since a legal challenge in 2020, it's no longer mandatory for all convictions for loitering and soliciting to be disclosed on a DBS check. But as we've heard from a lot of different people tonight, it often is. And that's because the police have a discretion to disclose any offence that they think might be relevant to the job that's being applied for. And it's because the information is retained on the woman's record until she turns 100 years old, as Laura has already mentioned tonight. I know from speaking to numerous women that this uncertainty, whether or not their conviction will be disclosed, deters them from applying for jobs in caring roles. And the powerful testimonies in the ECP report bear this out. The added problem, which the report mentions, is that women are often asked in job applications whether they have any unspent cautions or convictions, This is a complicated question. The law is very opaque in this area and changes frequently, and a lot of lawyers would get the question wrong. So given the choice of disclosing the conviction unnecessarily to a future employer, or potentially answering the question incorrectly, a lot of women just don't apply for the job. As the report points out, it's women who are disproportionately arrested under loitering and soliciting laws, and it's women who are disproportionately trained and experienced to work in caring professions, so there's a double discrimination going on. Another issue I've encountered is that frequently people issued with cautions are told by the police incorrectly that this is a slap on the wrist and won't show up on their record. Those women rely on that assurance only to find out that it's not the case when the caution's disclosed to their employer. I know of women who've resigned from their jobs due to the humiliation or withdrawn from a job offered to them, rather than have to explain the circumstances giving rise to the caution. Some women who engage in prostitution do meet the definition of victims of trafficking. The requirement to disclose a conviction that might arise from being trafficked violates a number of different anti-trafficking laws. So there are serious questions about whether the use of prostitutes' cautions and the law in relation to how they're retained and disclosed are compatible with the Human Rights Act. They might breach Article 4, the prohibition on slavery, Article 8, the right to privacy, Article 14, the prohibition on discrimination. They might also breach Article 1 of the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women. The report mentioned that women in ECP's network have successfully worked to get prostitutes' cautions expunged, and that's some of the work that I do. It requires an application to ACRO, the Criminal Records Office, and if that fails, the only way is to apply for judicial review with the help of a solicitor, and that's because, as Laura mentioned, there's no right of appeal. This is a complicated process, and it should be done, but there's many reasons why women don't attempt to do it, even when it's plain that they never should have received a caution in the first place, according to the law. Those include not knowing that they have a right to try to expunge their caution, not being eligible for legal aid, so not having the funds to pay privately for a lawyer, being frightened at the prospect of speaking to a lawyer, or having to confront the events that led to the caution being administered to them. Keeping women out of work leaves them with few options, and it's likely to lead them back into prostitution. It doesn't help their children, nor does it help the schools, hospitals or care homes that might have employed them. As the report says in its opening paragraphs, the unfairness of all of this was raised by Maureen Colgan MP back in 1979. Sadly, little has changed since then. Prostitutes' cautions are a stark example of how criminalising sex workers only exacerbates the underlying issues. I think it's time that they were abolished altogether.